So, I have been writing a book about my grandfather's escape from Hungary after the failed revolution of 1956. It's about the revolution and his escape, but I've been putting a lot of time and energy into this book and my husband's small business and the child and everything, so I haven't made any long form videos because they take a long time. And I'm always shadow banned on TikTok, but I've been over there a lot more than here, obviously. But this video is going to be about the Hungarian Revolution, kind of an overview for someone who maybe had no idea about any part of the revolution. It's not going to contain every single little detail, but it'll be enough to get a basic understanding of it. So first you've got to know that nothing happens in a vacuum, right? Nothing happens without a series of events that lead up to whatever it was. So the Hungarian Revolution that began on October 23rd of 1956 didn't truly begin on that day. That's just when the revolution began. And that was Hungary's third revolution in about 100 years. They had a very tumultuous past. For those who might not know, I put little definitions at the beginning of my book for things like the Soviet Union. So the definition of the Soviet Union is they were officially known as the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the USSR. They lasted from 1922 until 1991, when they were formally disbanded and finally left from all of the satellite states officially for good. It was the successor state to the Russian Empire, but it wasn't just Russia. The USSR became the federal union of 15 republics: Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Lithuania, Moldavia, Latvia, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Armenia, Turkmenistan, and Estonia. A lot of stands. After World War II, the Soviet Union remained in several of the countries that they had invaded, in order to win the war, and they created a Stalinist system in which they installed a communist government, gained control of the education, the press, the radio, and the police in 9 of their satellite states: Albania, Poland, Bulgaria, Romania, Czechoslovakia, Germany, part of Germany, Hungary, Yugoslavia, and Mongolia. Those were the satellite states. And then all of the others, all the Stans and Estonias that I listed before, those were the federal republics that made up the USSR. It was enormous. This is literally going to be from my book. This is what I wrote. On June 28th, 1956, about 100,000 Polish people protested in the streets of Poznan, which sparked several months of political reform. The industrial employees were disgruntled, to say the least, about the recent changes in policies that required them to work more to reach higher quotas for the same and, in some cases, less compensation. They demanded fair wages for the work demand, as well as lower prices for food and necessities, and for the government to reverse some of the recent laws that diminished working conditions throughout Poland. What started out as industrial workers going on a spontaneous strike, literally spontaneous, like they got to work at 6 a.m. and they were like, you know what, we're going on strike today. It grew to 100,000 people within a few hours. Employees at other industrial plants, students, and even some police officers joined the protest. The local police weren't able to tame the crowd, and it turned into a violent uprising quickly. The riots were easily stamped out within a day by the Soviets. The Poles throughout the country, though, were encouraged to resist the Soviet Union and demand freedom and the Polish United Workers' Party, the Communist Party, which ruled in the one-party state from 1948 to 1989, realized that political reform was necessary. This was similar to the situation in Hungary because there were Polish communists who were either Stalinists or anti-Stalinists, but they were all still communists. So the thing with communism that a lot of people like to argue about is that they say communism is the direct opposite of fascism. It's not. So there's this horseshoe theory, right? If you go far enough to the left, communism, you'll just end up back on the right, and the far right is fascism. Communist dictators and fascist dictators share so many similarities. So in communism, everyone's equal, right? There's fair wages, there's fair resources. If somebody can't work, then they're not forced to do it. They will get the work that they can to accommodate them. And, everyone's equal and whatnot, except for the guys at the top. And so it leaves room for a dictator to take power when everybody else is equal. And the dictator in question was Joseph Stalin. So he was born in Georgia, not America, Georgia, but like USSR, Georgia. And he became a dictator very quickly. And young Stalin can get it, okay? That's super weird of me to say. I'm sorry. But young Stalin was handsome. He had girls falling at his feet. And he was a psychopath, just like Hitler, you know? And Stalin was very much hated throughout the USSR and even throughout the Communist Party within Russia. Like, so many communists just did not like him. So when Stalin finally died in 1953, people who took over after him were like, we have to get rid of all the shit that he did. Like, it was called de-Stalinization, just to get rid of the things that he did that nobody appreciated. Anyways, the Polish Communist Party chose a new party boss, Władysław Gomulka. He was a moderate communist who had actually been in jail from 1951 to 54 due to Stalin's political purges. Political purges are something that I may talk about quite a lot because that happened quite a lot in all of those countries. And between 1945 and 1956 were some of the worst campaigns of political purges. Most of those campaigns were initiated by Stalin. And a political purge is just getting rid of people in the government that you don't like or don't agree with you by giving them false charges and putting them on a show trial, which was literally just to pretend like you're giving them a trial and then throwing them in jail for espionage they accused hundreds of thousands of people of being political enemies and Western spies. That was like their charge. Like, oh, you spent some time in France during the war? Spy, jail them, straight to jail, lock the key. And then, a lot of death, a lot of gulags, a lot of concentration camps. That's what a gulag is. So Poland's election of Gomulka actually really worried the Soviets, so much so that Khrushchev flew to Poland to confront them and try to get it changed. He said that the Soviet Union wouldn't recognize Gomulka's leadership, and that was really a bluff, and the Polish people knew that. They called the bluff. A few days later, Khrushchev relented. He recognized Gomulka's right to lead Poland and withdrew the Soviet soldiers he'd brought with him as protection. The Poles didn't want to eliminate communism. They wanted moderate reforms. They promised that the reforms wouldn't impede the Communist Party or the balance with the Eastern Bloc. And the worry that the Soviet Union, the USSR, the Russians at the top, the worry that they had that all of the riots that were happening in Poland and then subsequently in Hungary would trigger all of the other satellite states to then revolt and that they would lose their territory, their colonies. So the protests of the industrial people in Poznan, Poland it was like a transitional period for Poland and for Hungary, and it was regarded as one of the most pivotal moments in the Eastern Bloc and in Poland as a whole. Perhaps because of the significance and the impact it had on countries like Hungary, immediately afterwards, the communist authorities did their best to conceal and censor historical documents about the events in Poznan, effectively deleting any mention of the riots and the subsequent transition afterwards. The communists, like they did in Hungary, persecuted people who participated in the riots for several years afterwards. So there is a difference, though. You know how I said that there's the horseshoe theory, right? The further you go to the communist side, you just end up on the fascist side. So like Stalin and Hitler, same. The difference that I have found after studying World War II for 10 years and studying the Hungarian Revolution in depth, the difference I've found is that the Soviets, they were better at hiding what they did. They were better at committing atrocities and then deleting the information or just never creating the documents of the information in the first place. Like they hid everything they did because they knew it was against humanity, right? But the Nazis did not hide what they did. They in fact made documents of almost everything, and they had to burn and get rid of those documents at the end of the war when they knew that those documents would fall into the hands of the Allies. But they documented everything and then tried to get rid of it. See, the Soviets didn't document. They knew not to. So as one might expect, the Hungarians looked at the Polish protests and they thought, well, if they can get more autonomy after protesting, then we could surely do the same thing, right? Right, sure, we'll go with that. They also felt more patriotic during the month of October after the reburial of a man whom most Hungarians hated while he was alive, but they felt more patriotic after his reburial. It's a very ironic situation. So a man named Laszlo Rock was reburied by the request of his wife, Julia. She and him were both interrogated and imprisoned and tortured by the communists. But during his lifetime, Rock was a communist. Rock was a very hated figure in the government. He held positions of power within the government for a long time, including the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Minister of Interior, and the member of the High National Council. He helped organize the AVO, later name changed to AVH, which is what I mostly call it, but Hungarians just kept calling it the AVO because they said AVO and it was easier than AVH, you know? Anyways, that's besides the point. The AVH was the offshoot of the KGB. They were the secret police, and they were very, very bad people. So people hated Laszlo Rock. And then he became a victim of the communist regime himself, and he was transformed into a patriotic hero because the communists had him executed. Even more ironic is that Rock was part of some of the very first show trials. Like, he initiated the show trials. The show trials, I said that way too many times in such a short amount of time, basically was a trial in which the judge and the jury already knew what they would decide as far as whether or not the defendant was guilty, and they were always guilty, even if there was no evidence or facts, or even if there were facts that like proved that they were not guilty. Didn't even matter. The show trials were basically a theater production, and it was rehearsed and memorized. And sometimes they would have people like behind, like literally behind a curtain or behind a wall, feeding lines to people. And they would convict, execute, hang, imprison anybody who went through the show trials. So he started those, and then he was put on a show trial himself. He was popular among the communists during his lifetime, but then Rakowski, who is another super fun figure, was threatened by Rock's power and influence. Not that Rock actually threatened him per se, but Rakowski felt threatened by anybody. And whenever Rakowski felt threatened by somebody, which was quite often, he was a very fragile man, he would charge them with being a Western spy, charge them with espionage, put them in a prison camp, a gulag, or put them on a show trial and then just have them executed or thrown in prison for the rest of their lives. So that happened to Laszlo Rock, and he was betrayed by his own comrades, which wasn't unusual. Like, the communists did that to each other all the time. They were constantly throwing each other under the bus and in jail and hanging each other and saying, "You're a spy. No, you're a spy." It's basically like that Spider-Man meme where there's 3 Spider-Men and they're all pointing a gun at each other and they're all like, "It's you." And that's the communists. "You're the spy. You're the spy." Like, it was comical almost if it wasn't so horrible. So anyways, back to Rock. His wife, Julia, who actually heard his execution from her prison cell because she was in the same prison, on October 15th of 1949 is when he was executed. So it was almost 7 years to the day that he was killed and then reburied. But anyways, she had petitioned the government to give Rock a state funeral and then put him in the cemetery. I was going to say burial place. The cemetery for heroes, like revolutionary and war heroes. And at first the government was like, "No, just take some money." And it was quite a lot of money that they offered her. And she said, "No, all I want is just some respect for my damn husband." And they finally agreed, and they gave him a state funeral. It was raining, it was miserable, but what was it? 100,000 people, more than 100,000 people attended the funeral, the reburial of a man whom they hated. I have to emphasize, because it's important to know that he was hated during his lifetime by Hungarians, but then when he was executed by his comrades, he became a victim of the communist regime, and he was a martyr for the Hungarians. He was a hero. So at his reburial, where over 100,000 people attended to mourn him, there was this overwhelming sense of nationalism after the funeral was over. And these young, proud Hungarians who wanted change, kind of like the fire for the revolution was lit that day, which was just a few weeks prior to when the revolution actually began. After the reburial, about 500 students and, other people, but mostly students, marched to a monument in Buda. So Buda and Pest are like two different sides of the city. It's not like one, it is one city, but there's Buda and Pest, and they're on each side of the river. Anyways, they marched to a monument in Buda to protest the communists. The statue was a memorial to the first prime minister of Hungary, who the Austrians executed in 1849, which was 100 years earlier than when Rock was executed. So like little coincidental there. The man who was executed by the Austrians in 1849 was a Hungarian hero of the first Hungarian Revolution of 1849. The student demonstration was mostly just shouting anti-communist rhetoric, and it was quickly de-escalated by the police, but it was very foreshadowing of what would happen just a few weeks later. So on October 22nd, a group of students from the Technical University of Budapest got together and created a list of 16 points, 16 demands for reform within the country. And they wanted to broadcast their protest, which they were going to hold the next day. On the morning of October 23rd, there was a very short message on the radio that was announcing that the students were going to hold a demonstration later that day. Erno Gero, who's a person, shall we say, he arrived back from a trip and immediately went into a fit of rage because he did not want a protest like that. He was always mad. He was just a mad little man. At first, he wouldn't allow the protest. Like, he didn't want it to happen. And other people were like, if you don't allow the protest, then it's just going to get worse. Like, just let them protest. Because the governments know that protesting just, dissipates angst in young people. So it's not going to change anything. Most of the time, protests don't make any kind of difference, which is unfortunate to come to realize. But it just dissipates anger in the youth. And so they let us do it because, it's like when you scream into a pillow, right? Nothing changes, but you've scrumped. You've screamed the scrump, and you can get on with your life now. But anyways, so he didn't want to allow the protest. His council convinced him to let it happen, and then he was just a mad little man all day. So his council told him, let the protests happen. And then he went on the radio and said that all public gatherings were prohibited. And then an hour and a half later, he had the radio interrupted again and made the announcement that the public demonstrations in Budapest would no longer be banned. So the protest was back on. At about 3 p.m., the students began their march. A group of about 8,000 students marched from the Buda side of the river Danube, and another 12,000 marched from the Pest side. And they met in front of the Hungarian Parliament building, which is a huge, magnificent looking building on the east side of the city. That evening, with the protesters all gathered outside in the streets, a small group of students met with Valeria Benke. She was a politician, and she was the head of Kossuth Radio, accompanied by members of the secret police at all times. So they went to her and they said that the radio should belong to the people. And they asked for time on the air to list their 16 demands for microphones so that the protesters in the streets could voice their opinions out in the wild, right? Benke communicated with her superiors in the Communist Party, and they told her to negotiate so that they would avoid a riot, and she pretended to negotiate and agree. So Valeria Benke acted alone without the order or permission from her superiors, and she tricked the students. So they were given a microphone and they were told, you're going to go on the radio. So there was tens of thousands of people out in the streets, and they were on the microphone, and then they knew that they weren't actually on the air, like the lines were cut and replaced with music, because the people who were like really far away but still like could see the person who was on the microphone, they heard music on the radio instead of the kid that they were supposed to be hearing, one of the students. And so they realized that they had been tricked, and they got angry. Obviously, as one might expect. Jarrow, uncompromising and temperamental as always, went on the air and berated the protesters in an aggressive speech. He called them young revolutionaries and a mob that was trying to cause national subversion and provocation, and that they were trying to poison the youth with chauvinism. The Communist Party would later bicker about who was to blame for instigating the protests and the violence. Jarrow believed that a man named Imre Nagy was directly the person who instigated the revolution, because Nagy gave a speech at about 9 p.m. on the day of the protest, October 23rd, outside of the radio building after the radio incident, right, when they were tricked. And Nagy, that man, was very firm in the belief that Jarrow could have avoided the violence because he was the one that was aggressive and crazy, and he could have handled the situation better. And Benke could have not tricked them and pissed them off. Just a thought. Unsurprisingly, no newspaper reported on Nagy's speech that day, and no official record existed except for journalists in the crowd who later recorded what Nagy said. He basically began with a greeting of comrades to the crowd, which received shouts and boos. They were not a fan of that word because it was a communist word. Right? Nagy was unsure of what to do, obviously very upset by the initial reaction. He continued, "Citizens, I affectionately salute those who are present here. All my esteem goes out to you young, democratic Hungarians who, by your enthusiasm, would help to remove the obstacles that stand in the way of democratic socialism. It is in negotiations at the bosom of the party and by discussion of the problems that we will travel the road that leads to the settlement of our conflicts. We want to safeguard constitutional order and discipline. The government will not delay arriving at its decisions." The crowd was unpleased. His speech went over like a brick, and it was just not good. It was not what they wanted or needed to hear. It was just a political way to tell the citizens to be quiet and complacent. Nagy basically just urged the protesters to go home. And then they heckled him and they said, "No, we'll stay, you leave, you go home." And that upset him, his ego. He was very stumped. They were not happy with his speech and not happy with him, even though Imre Nagy was the man that the young revolutionaries wanted to take charge in the first place. So Nagy began singing the national anthem in a very poor attempt to regain control of the situation. Even his most ardent supporters knew that he greatly failed in that he missed the mark. He fucked up. He dropped the ball so hard. And although he was a moderate and an anti-Stalinist, he was still a communist at heart, so he still wanted communism. But all of the young revolutionaries wanted him because he was a moderate communist, and that's who they elected to be in charge of the revolution. Like, he was literally elected as prime minister around midnight of that day by the Russians. So a little bit about Imre Nagy. He was the Hungarian prime minister from 1953 to 1955, and then again from October 24th, about midnight, to November 4th of 1956, just for the revolution. He was the unelected political leader of the Hungarian Revolution, meaning like there was no election, but the Soviets were like, they want you, so you control it. Figure it out, I guess. After the revolution, he was deported to Romania, and then he later returned to Budapest to be tried in a secret prison, like a secret trial, and then he was sentenced to death. So he was the prime minister for a little bit, and then after him, a man named Matthias Rakowski was the leader. People hated him. People hated him so much. He was the leader of the Hungarian emigres in the Soviet Union from 1940 to 44, the first secretary of the Hungarian Communist Party, which is like the top dog position. He was the top dog of the Communist Party in Hungary from 1945 to July of 1956, the same year of the revolution. And he was chairman of the Council of Ministers of the People's Republic of Hungary from 1952 to 53. He was removed from that position by the Soviets after Stalin's death, and Imre Nagy took his place. Rakowski was the boss during the harshest of the political purges, and he was hated among the population. When Rakowski was replaced by Nagy, they basically just fought with each other for a couple of years until the revolution. It was a mess. They were the communists, they were supposed to be comrades, but they were all fighting with each other pretty much all the time. So Khrushchev actually put Nagy back into power and removed Rakowski because that's what the revolutionaries wanted. So he was like, fine, give it to him, have him control the situation. And he sent a couple of communist kind of emissaries there to oversee the situation and to make sure that the switch of power was done, smoothly. And he sent a couple of communists incognito, can you not, so that they could spy on the others. And that was a common thing for them to do, send a couple of people and then one to spy on them. Anyways, in Budapest, during the protest, the protesters became enraged. And by this point, by the time that they were enraged, there were more than 100,000 people there. And estimates go up to 200,000 people at the protest, which started as about 20,000 people, 200,000 people by the end of the night. So they were enraged because they were tricked by the radio people, and they tried to go to the radio building in order to get on the air. And they go in, the secret police is waiting for them, as they do. And at first they tried bashing in the door and then throwing bricks. And then they got inside. The secret police apprehended them and held them hostage, basically. And then the students outside the building demanded for the ones inside the building to be released. And then the secret police threw tear gas at the protesters, a favorite of theirs. And it backfired on them because the smoke went straight back into the building and smoked the whole place out. So But anyways, cat. Then they fired warning shots into the sky at the protesters. And then they killed several students almost instantly, some as they were trying to run away. They shot some in the back. The AVH, the secret police, began killing the protesters, and then all hell broke loose, as one might expect. But this is already super long, so next time.